So we're going to dive deep into the housing portion of the master plan. This has been one of a very active topic that has come up in every single thread of other conversations that we've had. And we've received so much feedback already to this point and have compiled it. And, now we're bringing it forward and these goals and action items. So thank you for hanging in there through this process and providing us with that very detailed and incredible feedback and being a part of the discussion so that we can really dive deep and make sure that, that these goals and action items are very meaningful and also make sense for our future. So without further ado, I will pass it off to Matt.
Thanks very much, Amber. And thanks everyone for joining us this evening. We really appreciate you making the time. Hopefully you're staying cool wherever you are. I don't know, Amber, you phrased it well, pleasantly warm. I'm not sure. I'm fairly hot, but I again, thank you for joining us this evening. This is our 5th master plan topic session for the Imagine Nashua master plan. Hopefully you've had a chance to join us at one of the prior sessions. My name is Matt Sullivan. I'm the planning department manager for the city of Nashua. And we're joined this evening by a few folks from the consulting team on the project, Util, Will Cohen, and Taskina Tareen, in addition to a few members of the city team, including Carter Falk and Julie Chismis on our end. Again, thank you all for being here. Tonight's session, as Amber says, is one focused on housing, which we all know is one of the primary topic areas within the master plan, certainly a critical focus for our community moving forward, and an area that the community has already dedicated resources and study to, as evidenced by the 2020 housing study that was done by the city. For those who have joined prior topic sessions for the master plan, we've tended to focus on really 2 different areas, one being draft goals and recommendations, and one being scenario planning. This evening, we won't really be doing too much in the realm of scenario planning, but I do encourage you to review the design concepts that are available on the Imagine Nashua page. Tonight, we're really going to dive in deep on some of those draft goals and recommendations that are available for the plan on the Imagine Nashua website. I would say one cliche and lead with this, and it's truly important tonight, and that is that this is not intended to be a Matt speaking for an hour-and-a-half session. This is intended to be an interactive discussion, and for those that have joined prior sessions, I hope that you do in fact engage with us. We've found, I think, that either interjecting or asking for clarification or perhaps disagreeing with some of the statements that we're going to review this evening have resulted in some of the most productive and high quality conversations that we've had throughout all of these conversations with folks just like you. Feel free to engage at any time, whether you want to use the raise hand function, whether you want to simply unmute and jump in, or certainly you can use visual cues by flagging one of us down. Hopefully we'll give you an opportunity to ask a question or provide some feedback on whatever we're looking at. I think I can speak for everyone that our objective tonight is really to have a conversation that moves these goals and recommendations forward towards stronger consensus as we move into the final stages of plan development. Just a few quick notes before we jump in. If you'd like to explore the goals and recommendations on your own, either during the session or after the session tonight, I'll drop a link in the chat so that you can certainly do that. It's a nice interactive page that Util has worked hard to create, and it's a nice engaging format that you're welcome to look at. Additionally, if you aren't comfortable speaking out tonight or leaving a comment in the chat, there is a submission form that you can use if you'd like to leave some longer form feedback, and I'll drop that link in the chat in just a second as well. Before we jump in and start our conversation, are there any questions about format for tonight? No? All right, so let's jump in and start with reviewing the first goal, which is one of what we would call a high priority goal, and that is housing accessibility. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen here. And please let me know if you have any issues seeing the screen at any time during the discussion this evening. What I'll do is I'll paraphrase each of these items. And again, if you have any questions, please feel free to jump in. The first goal, housing accessibility, is to create a greater mix of housing types that are accessible to Nashua residents at all life stages, household compositions, physical abilities, and socioeconomic levels, as identified in the 2020 City Housing Study. Below that goal, we have a few recommendations that are fairly specific. Number one is promoting mixed income and multi-generational neighborhoods by enabling the development and distribution of a wider range of housing types, including, as just a few examples, 2- and 3-family dwellings, townhomes, and community housing, so having a couple different forms of housing development. Second action is allowing for more density, if you will. I think we've all heard that phrase used in housing conversation, both in the city and certainly in the state and nationally, but specifically doing this through rezoning of appropriate redevelopment and development areas that are identified through the Imagine Nashua visioning and planning process. And that gets to some of those scenarios that I discussed just a few minutes ago. And to also improve the supply side availability of residential and commercial space. We know that supply is one of the huge strains both in Nashua and throughout the state of New Hampshire. And one of the ways that we can directly impact that is by actually going through some rezoning processes here in the city. The third recommendation is to continue to advance the recommendations within the 2020 housing study. And this is my opportunity to say, much of what we're looking at doing tonight is already really well laid out in that 2020 study that was done by the city. It's a really fresh document, and one of the primary drivers behind a lot of the policy that you'll see here discussed. This 2020 housing study got down to a really granular level about specific changes that might be made both in the zoning ordinance, the development code, and also in some other policy areas in the city. So we really want to make a direct connection between that study's work and what we're proposing to do in the master plan. That's what we'd like to do here. We do currently have one flexible housing, or one of, I guess, many flexible housing tools within our ordinance, and that is the accessory dwelling unit portion of the ordinance, or ADUs. This was a really important piece of state legislation several years ago. And like all communities in the state of New Hampshire, we incorporated it into our zoning ordinance, but we are looking at whether or not ADUs could potentially be allowed what we call by right, or permitted in really all zones without any special zoning permissions. Right now, that's not currently the case, and allowing that to be done in the future would potentially allow for more flexible forms of housing that we don't necessarily see in all of our development zones right now in the city. Any questions just yet? I know I've gone through a few goals and recommendations. Any comments on any of these? And feel free to jump in. I can't see everyone right now in my screen view, so please do pipe up if you have any concerns.
I would also just note that many of these actions are fairly self-explanatory. It's in many other cases where if you click it, there's like a lot of detail. That's generally not the case for a lot of the ones here. They sort of say what they need to say in the main sentence, but that continue to advance key recommendations in the housing study. We put two, it seems like there's two sort of obvious first ones, which is that creating an affordable housing trust fund and updating the inclusionary housing rules are really, really important. I mean, arguably these could conceivably be actions versus recommendations, but it just seems like there's already like 10 actions on this goal. So some of the ones that didn't get called all the way out, we're adding those in. And if you think there's other parts of the housing study, we would be more than happy to sort of call out additional pieces.
Thank you, Will. Sherry, I see you have your hand raised. Go ahead whenever you're ready. Oops, Sherry, I see your hand is raised. Can
you explain to me? Can you hear?
Sherry, you're a little broken up, but go ahead.
Okay, can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay. Can you describe what the community housing looks like? That's question number one. The other question I always had, when we talk about like 2 and 3 family dwellings, duplexes, how do you handle the maintenance on something on the outside of the building when one person owns one and another person owns the other?
Sure. So I'll start off with, I guess, the second piece of your question, Sherry, and that is, it depends on the type of ownership for the duplex. In many cases, we're seeing duplexes proposed in some sort of condominium ownership. And in those cases, it's an association's responsibility to ensure that the property is maintained in a high quality manner. I think the exception to that would, of course, be in the event that you have condoized individual units within a duplex and each property owner is responsible for their own section of the duplex. Really, the only solution there is potentially a property maintenance code, which we don't currently have that would enforce that type of rule within the city. But we have to remember that duplex is a form and it can be renter or owner occupied. So the maintenance of that property really is something that we'd have to have a policy change on, I think, at a city level to ensure that it's kept up in accordance with some code. Other than that, it's a homeowners association that would have to drive any change there. To your first question about community housing, I don't know that we have a specific form in mind. Perhaps Will, you could maybe speak to this in a bit more detail behind the recommendation, but I think we're seeing a variety of types and forms of community housing around the country. I think this is simply a door that we want to leave open to allow that it might be, to allow it in the future, not necessarily recognizing what it might look like in its final form.
I think Matt said it very, very well. I would say there's a couple, it's the big question in the world of architecture, and I want to be very clear, I am absolutely not an architect. I sit next to a bunch of architects, and so my knowledge is sort of via osmosis. But in many cases, the million dollar, or I don't know how many, it's real estate, so it's expensive. The big question is, what is the next triple decker, right? Because in the end, it's actually fairly expensive to build something that looks like a triple decker built a century ago due to updated building codes, fire code, sound proofing, insulation, like all sorts of other things. You can do it, but in many cases, we see them costing more than a century ago. Triple deckers were the cheap and easy way to build a lot of housing. So now they're the less cheap way to build stuff that looks like your neighbors, if that makes some sense. So the big question is, what's the next triple decker from a building perspective? The sort of not ideal answer is something which I think I touched on in a previous focus group, which is that the thing which in many cases real estate investment trusts and sort of large scale institutional investors, the people that back housing development with the people with the deep pockets, they want to basically build something which is predictable and at that sweet spot of cost versus return. And in many cases, that is building as much as you can using wood. That's not to say that all housing going forward need that density. There's a couple other, I'm worried that I might be breaking up. Can you still hear me?
You're breaking up a little bit, Will, but I think you're back.
Okay. The other, just in my sort of my other housing work across the US, one of the more promising types, but we have not, I want to be very clear, we have not talked about this at all in Nashua. I have absolutely no reason to think that it's particularly ready for the building code, but in many cases, in a lot of other cities, an interesting type is what's oftentimes called the big house, which is exactly what it sounds like. It looks like a really big house, but inside it are a number of units, somewhere from 6 to 8, with the big catch that there is a shared component to all of them. It could be a kitchen, it could be a community space, it could be something else. And so what you get from that is almost as costly, possibly more cost, depending on where you go. It has that same level of cost effectiveness as some of these denser types of housing, because you're not building 6, 8, 12 individual units. You're building a large number of those with some version of the space being shared. There's a lot of evidence that that kind of housing model is more appealing to the younger generation. They're more perhaps willing to embed or embrace some version of community space if it means that the cost of housing goes down. And that would be sort of a sweet spot in between the triple decker. I mean, if you ask any architect, they all have their own answers. So the short answer is community housing means whatever that ends up being. And that's an active question in the design field.
Gene, I do see you had your hand raised, and I see your comments within the chat regarding first floor commercial, second floor, or floor above residential. We absolutely do allow that within certain zones in the city. I think we are looking, when we look forward to our land use code update, whether or not that's more appropriate or less appropriate in certain areas. But it is something we do currently permit, and it's not, it's not a prohibited use in the downtown area, particularly where we'd want to see that form of development.
And just the one thing I would add to Gene's point, while I'm spending way too much time talking, is the catch to the Commonwealth Ave model is the return still has to be high enough the person wants to build the thing. And in many cases, the commercial is the part which we have to sort of, subsidize is the wrong word, but it's like, let it grow like a little baby bird. And so in many cases, the sort of level of height that appears in Com Ave, where it's really, 3-ish stories over the commercial, that works when you have a robust level of commercial retail activity where people want to be filling it right off the bat. But in a situation where there's not necessarily that level of density yet, in many cases, to solve the chicken and egg problem, you end up a little bit higher, more towards that, as I've mentioned, 5/1 kind of look. Because ultimately, the big lesson there's like a rule of thumb, I forget the number of square feet, and I'm sorry, I need to look it up again. But in the world of sort of commercial real estate or retail urban planning, it's like some number of square feet of housing, or sorry, some number of units of housing, or let me say it again. Sorry, I'm remembering what the rule of thumb is. It's something like every new unit of housing provides X number of square feet of retail. I mean, that's not actually true. If you build 1 unit of housing, you're not going to build 20 feet of commercial space or 40 feet of commercial space. But the idea would be that it's like a watershed or something, a catchment area. And ultimately, to support a certain amount of retail space, you need to build housing, a certain number of units of housing to kind of support it. It's just a rule of thumb, but I think it differs a little bit between city and suburb. And that's where really additional market analysis during, retail studies can sort of provide better evidence as to where that number falls. But whether or not we know the exact number, it's a good thought exercise that if we're going to ever want retail on the bottom, that means we need some number of additional units every single time, which is a long way of saying density matters when it comes to adding commercial space.
Thank you, Will. That's great. And I do want to emphasize too that to Will's point, I'm glad he caught me here. There are 2 very specific sort of next level of recommendation within this 2020 housing that I think are important to call out. One is the creation of an affordable housing trust fund, which we've already done. We really want to emphasize, though, determining how it's used and how it continues to be funded into the future. We view this as a critical component of affordable housing provision, but we also need to provide more definition around it. And we think this plan is a great way to set some groundwork for doing that. Additionally, we are currently talking about the process of updating potentially the city's inclusionary zoning ordinance, which would require a specific number of affordable units be built with projects. That's something we're actively beginning to work on, but important to lay the foundation for what that work becomes down the line. And therefore, we wanted to call that out specifically as its own recommendation here. And it looks like Sherry might be raising her hand, but she's a bit frozen. Oh, perhaps not. Okay, I'm going to move on to some of the other recommendations within this goal. Thanks, Sherry, for that. I saw that. Additionally, we do want to look at whether we should be evaluating opportunities to renovate older structures for improved affordable housing throughout the city. Within the 2020 study, there was an identification of a large quantity of older housing stock, particularly in the downtown core, that could provide a lot of housing opportunities should it be improved and the quality improved for other residents. That's something we'd like to look at and really focus our efforts on. We have a large supply that I think would be eligible for some of that upgrade. Additionally, we want to explore micro apartments as one of the tools to expand housing choice and help address housing affordability. When we're talking about micro apartments, we're not talking about the 600 square foot studio. We're talking about 300 square foot units. We've seen some conversation about that size of units around the state in communities like Portsmouth. And believe it or not, there's a real demand for some of that, particularly for young professionals, which we know are a critical piece of our community's future moving forward. Therefore, I think we would be remiss to not look at that as an option in some areas within the community, and certainly we want to integrate it here. Investment in resources that help the elderly to age in place. Obviously, the elderly population are a critical component of the city's health and vitality moving forward. And we want to look at some options to actually incentivize them and allow them to age in place, whether it be through the provision of public transit subsidies, real estate tax abatements, which are currently offered, and programs for retrofitting existing units. As we know, the single-story ranch within the urban core and its surrounding areas is one of the most sought-after unit types, not only because it's small and affordable for young professionals, but also because its universal design allows for the elderly to age into it nicely. The more housing that we can provide of that type, I think, is a great piece of our housing portfolio moving forward, and certainly it would allow folks to age in place. We want to maintain an inventory of publicly owned land that might be suitable for new affordable housing, both in the downtown core and the surrounding areas. We obviously have publicly owned parcels currently that may be viable for housing development, and certainly we should have an open eye in the future towards acquiring additional property for that reason. And then moving back to sort of the idea of aging in place, implementing a policy that requires that all new housing have ADA accessibility, and also implementing UDI or universal design standards for all housing that's created in the future to ensure that it really is marketable and attractive for a variety of age demographics as well, should it be turned over in the future. Any questions on these recommendations within the top priority goal for housing accessibility? See a comment from Betsy. Yes, great, appreciate that. Totally agree. Any questions or comments on this before we jump into the more specific housing goals and recommendations? Okay, let's move on then. The next housing, oh, yes, Peter, please.
I have a quick question about the publicly owned properties you were just talking about.
Sure.
I mean, currently what the city's been doing is selling all their property to developers. So what exactly does that mean? You mean that they will hold it and they will own the properties for rent?
So yeah, no, great question. And I think I may have slightly misspoke about what the intent of that recommendation was. The intent is that we currently have a lot of property that the city owns. Some of that property may be viable as developable property for housing. We have not really done the detailed analysis to determine which of those properties might fit into that category. That's what that recommendation really drives at. Looking at each piece, how developable is it? Is it an attractive piece of property from an access and how does it fit into the larger policies of the master plan? That analysis has not been done at a detailed level for each of the city properties to date.
There is a beta group that meets
yes.
every so often, and they do that.
Yes.
Continually, sort of. Okay.
Yeah, absolutely. A great example of that is the recently approved Renaissance 2 project that the BIDA was involved with. That is a city property that was specifically targeted for housing development. It's really just that sort of auditing of all of the properties to determine their viability for development that needs to be done as part of that recommendation. But great point. Before I jump into the next, I would just sort of, to Peter's point, emphasize that many of the efforts that are discussed here in these goals and recommendations are underway already. This is really just a bolstering of many of those and then a recommendation to continue to engage in these policies moving forward. Housing affordability and stability. Update policies and regulations to increase and maintain rental and ownership affordability across the city and remove barriers to accessing affordable housing options. And then specifically within that goal, again, as recommended in the 2020 housing study, use land use policy and zoning to address housing choice, affordability, and location in the city, with a focus on housing in the downtown and South Main Street, housing along major commercial corridors, integrating missing middle housing, really that middle affordability, into the existing city fabric, distribution of affordable housing options across other parts of the city, and then adding or changing housing programs or funding over time. So those 5 sort of focus areas within the housing choice and affordability and location options. Again, leveraging, oh, Jean, I see you have your hand up. I want to unmute, go ahead.
Yeah, as I indicated in the chat, it should not be just currently city-owned property. The city should consider acquiring appropriate property for future development of affordable housing.
Yeah, agreed. That's absolutely true, Gene. We certainly don't want to box ourselves into parcels that are currently owned by the city. We, I think, do want to have our eyes open, if you will, to future opportunities that do present themselves. And if the city is able to play sort of the middleman role, if you will, in the development of one of those, I think we do want to keep our options open. So well said, yes.
Okay.
I do have, if I can make a comment on that quickly,
Please.
Is that, there are some places that will, like a city will buy a property, but then, it doesn't cost the city the full price of that property because they're going to turn it over at some point. So it's the delta. They could even make money sometimes. But the point is, even if they think it's a property is very desirable, if they buy that and even sell it a little bit lower than what they bought it for, it would only cost them that increment. You know, I mean, like the Society for the Preservation of Forests in New Hampshire, whatever, they do that. They buy chunks of property and then they resell it with certain provisions on it. You know, and so it doesn't cost them the whole cost of that. Sure. Because I don't see the city doing that much that way. Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
That's a great point. Any other comments before we jump into the next few? Okay, again, leveraging public land for housing production. We've touched on this a bit. You know, and Peter, to your point about incentive, exploring options about tax payment if affordable housing is included, selling the land at a significant discount to developers in the event that they are willing to construct affordable housing or have some city interest reflected in what they're going to do, or providing a grant or no interest rate loan for a portion of the cost of the housing. Those are all options and incentives that I think we want to look at. And certainly incentivizing development is the role that the city wants to play. We've also talked about considering hosting sort of a developer tour or roundtable to showcase and market available sites, specifically public and private sites, so really all sites that are available for development. And I think one of the critical things here, and this gets to the land use code as well, is how do we identify barriers to development of these properties, whether they be development code-based barriers, environmental barriers, or other. That's a conversation that we'd like to have actively with developers rather than sort of those remaining unknown and the city is not able to then act proactively. Betsy, I see you have your hand up.
Yes, thank you.
Of course.
I am firmly in the let's preserve every bit of our existing open space and land and reuse available sites in order to protect the environment.
Great.
Thank you.
I think Betsy, to your point, a good deal of the policy that's emerging in this plan is focused on redevelopment and infill development rather than the development of parcels that have some high natural resource value. So I think that your concern is one that I believe is reflected in this plan, and I expect that a lot of folks on the meeting this evening would support just that.
Betsy, I support you. I give you a thumbs up.
Great, thanks, Caroline. Excellent.
Thank you.
Of course. Okay, Tom.
Yes, I have two questions.
Sure.
I'm connected with Family Promise, and I recently have been impressed with the soup kitchens adding space for homeless people. Mm-hmm. And I'm wondering how we educate people to buy and look at the market and learn how to evaluate property in a given situation, because buying a house is so different than when I bought a house years ago. So that's one of my questions. And the other is this document that you're using available, and where do you get it if it is?
Sure, Tom, I'm happy to hit your second question first, because I think that's, and Amber, thank you for dropping it in the chat. Tom, the document is available either through the link that's posted in the chat, or if you want to enter it into your browser, it's at imagine.nashuanh.gov. And there's a link to the goals and recommendations page there. And once you're there, you're welcome to browse at your own rate. But these are all available for your review, and we welcome any comments either this evening in this session or certainly via the form that I posted in the chat as well. To your first question, I think it's a complicated one, and I'd welcome the wisdom of others in answering it. I think that you're getting to really an education issue that I think that we're not, I don't know that we're really addressing head on in the recommendations that we've drafted here. I do think one of the themes that's emerged in a lot of our conversations is that there's a need for collaboration and coordination between the city and other entities that are doing work in the housing space. And I think that a discussion about how to educate first-time home buyers and others that are looking for their first ownership or even renting opportunity might be one that we want to talk to other groups about. And I see, Amber, you have your hand up. So please, if you have any thoughts on this, go ahead and jump in.
Yeah, so that's a great question. And there is a group, I just wasn't able to Google fast enough, out of Manchester that does host and maybe not so much the last year, but they do host first-time home ownership, whether it's an individual or a family, whether they're looking for investment opportunities or, for themselves. And they do host those. There's also a number of different realtors that also would offer that as well. And I think either Erica or Betsy probably have the name of the place I can't think of.
Paul McLaughlin just dropped it in the chat at NeighborWorks Southern New Hampshire and Home Team NH. Yeah. Home buyer education.
Does this apply to apartments as well?
Yes, affordable housing apartments.
Okay,
so we
great.
can drop both links in the chat.
I would also just add to New Hampshire Housing Finance Authority is a great resource for first-time home buying, particularly, and they've done tremendous work in the state, and I can drop the link to their website in the chat as well. But Betsy, I see you have your hand up as well, and you're on mute.
Oh, thank you. Sorry, I'm going to that, so I'm all confused. I was also wondering, and you haven't really gotten to those goals yet, but it ties in, is around. Could there be something around making sure that education is available in languages other than English to really kind of look at this from a equity and inclusion perspective?
I think it's a wonderful idea. That's certainly a thread that's woven throughout a lot of the recommendations in the plan. And I think to call it out specifically here would be a fantastic idea. Yes.
Thank you.
Erica, you had your hand up. I don't know if you wanted to add something.
No, I'm all set. I just wanted to talk about NeighborWorks.
Okay, great. Thank you. Yeah, of course. Peter, you're on mute too. And no excuse. You've done this a million times. No excuse there.
I have done it a million times.
Just kidding. Go ahead.
I've done it a million times both ways. But I wanted to say that, several years ago, banks used to give free sort of lectures on this downtown. And I don't know if it's because of COVID or maybe it died out or something, but that was very common. Now it's true, it wasn't quite as broad as what we're talking about, because we're talking about, renters, and we're talking about, affordable housing, all that. Banks are mostly interested in giving out loans. But I think, that can be made, I think there are organizations around that are willing to do that for free if we push it somewhere.
Yeah, that's a great point. I don't know that we've asked that question, right? I think that's something that we need to do as a result of what we're hearing tonight. Paul, I see that you're happy with that recommendation. Anything you wanted to add? I saw the
Sure.
applause.
I was trying to raise my hand. Unfortunately, I could not figure out how, so I apologize.
No, that's all right. And applause is a good, that got me. So you're good. Go ahead.
Yeah. So I'm going to, hopefully fill in for Erica on some of this stuff. I'm the homeownership program director for NeighborWorks Southern New Hampshire. The name of the homeownership program is called Home Team. We provide education and one-on-one counseling, pretty much from Nashua all the way up to Laconia. We did formerly have an office over in the United Way's office on Broad Street. We got rid of that because of COVID. We stopped seeing people in person, started using Zoom. I am hopeful we will get back to in-person seminars in the fall. Fingers crossed. We're watching I was going to say the weather reports, but the health reports. And we typically have about 25 people. We do them at least once a month throughout the the southern part of the state. And we have down payment assistance programs that we provide. We hook people up. We bring in those expert realtors and lenders and home inspectors. It's a full 8-hour submersive home buyer education program. I'm happy that, I shared the link there. Happy to answer any questions on it.
Great. Thanks, Paul. Appreciate that.
And just as a quick note, so you all know, right since I went to urban planning school, I figured now that I know that it's easy. They did the outreach for me effectively, but I did that one right out of school. It took about 6 or 7 years before I actually made it to be able to consider buying property. But those lessons, they're really good. And exactly what Paul just said, that is exactly the point of the class. And everyone I went in the class with, it's a robust program across the country. It's a good thing. And our job in the master plan is to help encourage those efforts to continue.
Yeah, great. Peter, go ahead.
Well, was that in high school or was that in college, or what were you talking about there?
This was actually right out of graduate school. So I fully acknowledge I'm not exclusively the target audience of all these sorts of things, but I'll say even though I went to school to learn about the importance of all this stuff, that's really, really different than all the things that they're talking about, which is how on earth you do this, how you get the money saved up for a down payment, how you figure out how to budget it. And it was, even for someone who has a graduate degree, it was hard. So the use of it to everyone else who's seeking all this, it's fundamental.
The reason I bring it up is because I've met a lot of people in Nashua that don't have a clue. They've always rented and they have no idea how you would transition. And if we taught this in high school, at least in terms of what the process is, so if someday they get to the point where they think they have enough money they could do this, to have some clue of what's going on. Because I think some people simply don't have a clue. And if they don't have a clue, they're not going to try unless somehow or other they get a vision that this is possible.
If I could just add into that again, we do, there is no specific age group. We have people coming to our classes from 20 years old up to 80 years old. As you said, you don't know what you don't know. No. So, we do our best to get them there, and regardless though, just kind of carrying on in the conversation, we can teach till we're blue in the face. We need to really realize what is affordable housing. Don't build me a $400,000 house and tell me a young family with 3 kids making $20 an hour can afford it. They can't. They can. Our sweet spot for most of our home buyers that's sustainable and not going to put them in trouble is about $250,000. Go on realtor.com right now. You'll find 2 houses that are available that aren't contingent for sale in Nashua, and they're 2 bedrooms. So forget it. You're not, that family's not going to move in there. And we need to think about these people that are working in the service industry that aren't making, more than minimum wage. They want to buy too. They're very anxious. Some of them have some savings. But what can we do to get them into that dream of single family home ownership that they can afford? And, we went through a whole subprime, travesty in our lives. We helped thousands of people throughout New Hampshire save their homes from foreclosure. But that was the problem. People got into homes they shouldn't have to begin with. And, we can do something about that. And I think incentivizing builders, doing whatever you can to get people to build something that's affordable, because I've seen them build $350,000 and $400,000 homes and call them affordable housing. I don't know who that's affordable to in most of the blue collar working world, but that's just my piece. So thank you.
There's one piece. I haven't actually touched on this yet because this has been so action and recommendation oriented. This is the kind of thing which, just to be very clear, needs to go into the filler's the wrong word, additional text of the draft master plan. This question of how you build the stuff is another really big question about housing. And there's a section in one of the previous goals that Matt was pointing out that it was saying the importance of adding new housing, and then it's to increase supply side availability. That was sort of that additional phrase. That gets at a really, really major idea. It's not totally proven, it's not totally conclusive, but all signs point to it's still helping. And the basic idea here would be, even if again, we're not saying we should only be building a luxury house. That's absolutely not the point of the plan. But even if a unit is built that is more expensive than an affordable unit, what evidence seems to show, and there's been a lot of research based on sort of zip code sales and sort of trying their best to reconstruct this in different markets. If a fancy unit gets built that's newer or in better shape or something like that, it is more than likely that another household that's occupying either a family-sized unit, maybe it's bigger but not as good shape, but the rent is higher. Someone who has the means to afford that more expensive unit moves into that one, which then makes that other unit freed up for a new family or a new something, and then someone moves into that. And so there's actually evidence that if you follow a fair number of these links, if you go 3 or 4 or something like that, for every new, even a luxury unit of housing built, it indirectly leads to the construction of 50% of units down the line ending up being affordable. So the idea here behind supply side is that even if some of the development being built is apartments, it's for smaller households, it's for people with higher levels of income, which is not the goal of the entire plan. Even in those circumstances, just building more housing of any kind is one of the many tools in our toolkit to try to free up what Paul was talking about, that dream of, single family home ownership or whatever the mortgage is. So that's why we're talking about density, actually. That's why that's such an essential piece of the plan. Sorry to ramble.
Oh, that's all right. Gene, I don't know if you wanted to say anything. I see that you're unmuted, and if not, that's okay. Okay, great. And I think, Betsy, to your question that you just put in the chat about more owner-occupied multi-unit housing, I think it's a great idea. I mean, I think the condo conversion of multifamily is something we haven't seen a tremendous amount of in the city. It does exist, but removing barriers to that happening is certainly something that we can look at from an approval and a land use development code perspective. There are certain things that we can pull out of the way to allow that to happen more easily. As far as the developer side of that, there are other factors as to why that's not necessarily beneficial to the development community, but I think it's something worth having a conversation with them directly about. And I see, Peter, I see your comment about housing mix. Certainly that's something that's emphasized, I think, in the recommendations that we're looking at, and something that we are, prioritizing, I think, moving forward. Just to get back quickly to some of the goals and recommendations, and certainly, again, we love this open discussion. We do not need to structure it specifically on these goals and recommendations. So I'll try to move fairly quickly so that we have more time for this discussion and still get you out in the 90-minute time frame. But let me go ahead and share my screen one more time just to get into some specifics. Expanding, and we were getting at some of this, rental and owner rehab programs. Currently, the city has 2 separate rehab programs available to it, or available to folks within the city. The first is the Housing Improvement Program, the HIP, which provides 0% interest loans to correct code, safety, health, or accessibility issues. The city also offers, on the rental side of things, a rental rehab program to assist landlords with correcting serious code, safety, health, and other violations. But specific recommendations include really prioritizing those funds in the rehabilitation of property in the downtown core. Again, going back to the 2020 housing study, this is an area of extreme need. There's a need for additional outreach and education about the availability of these funds and the availability of these programs. That's something that we'd like to prioritize in the downtown area. And then further, just making sure that these programs remain in place and educating the public about their value. I'm guessing that some of the folks on this call were not available or not aware of these programs, and certainly we want to ensure their long-term viability. Betsy, I see you have a question. I'll let you jump in.
Sure. I'm just wondering if there are any funds for also like beautification for homes for people to either paint or upgrade siding, because I feel like there'd be so much more pride in living on a certain street if there was like a makeover.
Yes, I am not aware of any funds on the city side of things for that type of program. I'm not sure if any other folks on here are aware of anything. Amber?
Excellent question. One that we're talking about in French Hill area currently is community development block grants. However, you would have to partner with something like NeighborWorks to do so. And they would act as the fiscal agent and establish a committee that would help select those projects. Also, some local churches have done that before. Within the last 10 years, they've done that in certain neighborhoods as well. So there are some things that can be worked. It's just a matter of somebody taking the lead and making it happen.
I just spoke without raising my hand, but I put a link in the chat pod without explaining what it was. And we do have some programs through our urban programs department at the city of Nashua. I threw a link in on one that deals with rehab, home improvement rehabs. It's not always at the individual homeowner. It could be at if it's a rental unit, so at the property owner side. But the point is that there are some limited funds available for rehab.
Great, thanks, Julie, for keeping me in check on that. Any other comments on this specific item before we move on? Okay, we covered this one a little bit. First time home buyer program, reintroducing it. Obviously, we have that affordable housing fund that I referenced a few moments ago. This might be an option for using those funds. to revisit the feasibility of actually creating home buyer assistance moving forward. I think certainly getting to the question of education of new first-time buyers and the capital ability of those buyers, this would potentially close that gap. I think it's something that we're very interested in as a city, and we want to make sure we include it here. And I think one of the questions we need to look at is, how do we actually implement that? How do we offer it? What's the program that we're using to do that? That's definitely something we'd like to look at long term, but haven't provided real specific definition to what it might look like. But we believe it's an important priority for us moving forward. This last one is an interesting one. It's one that I think we need to continue to drive on, and that is employer-assisted housing, beginning a conversation or keeping conversations going with large employers within the community, folks like Southern New Hampshire, other entities that are offering a lot of jobs within the community. They have a vested interest in their employees' ability to remain in the community, to live close to their work. We are having ongoing conversations with them, but actually implementing some of those conversations in the form of employer-assisted housing is something that we'd like to continue to strive towards. I think there are a lot of folks on this call that have had conversations around this issue, but it's something that we'd like to see done more in the community. No specific recommendations below this one, but certainly a priority. Any questions or comments here?
I do wonder whether,
Sure.
for like the hospitals, whether rental property is more appropriate, because they have a lot of young people coming in, staying for a few years, and then moving on, as they get their education done or whatever.
Yeah, I think rentals are an option, Peter. I think like anything that we're talking about tonight, a mix is probably the most appropriate solution. I do know that some other hospitals within the state of New Hampshire have done some pretty incredible things to get first-time home buyers into homes. And I think that there are some really good and transferable examples out there. But you're right, multifamily is certainly an option, particularly for certain, I think, employees at these employers. So yeah, absolutely.
I think just a quick tip to add to your notes is at Southern, we can't accept Google Docs. And I believe that Tim recently was in communication with our facilities person with a Google Doc. So if you haven't heard from us, that might be why.
Okay. All right, great. Thank you. Good to know. Any other comments on this? All right, let's move into environmental sustainability, which may feel a bit out of place at first blush, but really this is a focus on green building standards in a broad sense. The goal here is to promote and support high quality green building design that is climate resilient and energy efficient. This sort of gets back to one of the major threads that's running through this master plan as a whole, and getting down to the built environment component of that. The first action is that all new construction and building renovations and upgrades should be designed and maintained for resource efficiency and greenhouse gas reduction. Specifically, phasing out fossil fuel systems for heating appliances and encouraging the retrofit of full electrification for existing buildings. And specifically getting to the land use recodification, revising the land use code to explore requiring renewable energy facilities such as solar and energy storage for new multifamily residential constructions. This is a really interesting one that other communities like Dover have looked at doing, one that I think is a bit down the road, but something that we should be thinking proactively about writing into our code, at least making these facilities green ready through the development review process. Asking that new construction meet the strictest LEED standards or better when stricter standards are actually developed in the future. I know that Bill McKinney was on the call. I'm sure he would have some comment about this, but certainly this is something that we should look at moving forward. Pushing the existing zoning that encourages the use of solar, wind, and renewable energy systems to require all new construction use renewables. That's something interesting that I think that we'd want to work into our land use code. Creating zoning for preservation and adaptive reuse to reduce greenhouse gas emissions from new building materials. Conducting a vulnerability assessment of the city, creating a passive house standard for the city, establishing requirements for new construction to include EV charging infrastructure, eco roofs, and bike and ped amenities. One of the things I point out here is we're really, I think, at the first stage talking about readiness for this technology, not necessarily fully requiring it for all new development, but looking at least being prepared for these technologies to be implemented at the larger scale. Next, with the expansion of regional rail, encouraging transit-oriented development by permitting new development in close proximity to the train station. This is something the city has actually done a tremendous job already of setting the stage for through some of its TOD land use ordinances, but continuing to encourage that development to happen in a form that's compatible with the anticipated offer of rail access in these locations, particularly at the Crown Street and in the South Nashua potential rail station locations. We want to really have transit-oriented development, as we call it, in those areas with uses that are appropriate for the area. And Sherry, I see your hand is up. Go ahead.
Me?
No, I see Sherry has her hand up.
I just wanted to add, what about doing some, okay, can you hear me?
I can, Sherry. You're a little bit broken up, but we can hear you.
Okay. Any thoughts about doing some code changes regarding the amount of grass that people can have or that developers can put in, and put some kind of a ratio in terms of beddings to grass? And the other thing is, when I was talking to George Hurd the other day, he was telling me that some of the plans that he brings before the city, that in the plan, he has to actually plant a tree. Okay. Now the homeowner can take the tree down after they buy it, but in order to get the plan approved, he has to have a tree planted on every house that he builds. So I was wondering if we were thinking about those lines.
Well, I think the first thing, and that I'm seeing Carter's here, and he deals with the open space requirement on a very frequent basis. I think it's very worthwhile to look at whether or not our open space requirements for any type of development are in fact delivering the results that we'd like to see. We've had a lot of conversation, particularly around the use of pervious pavers and replacements that sort of walk the line of what's grass, what's open space, and what's not. I think looking at those thresholds through this plan, and particularly through the land use recodification, is a worthwhile exercise. I think these somewhat arbitrary percentages that we currently have in place are worth a review. So the answer is yes to that. And to your second point, Sherry, yes, we do have landscaping standards that require trees be planted when it comes to any subdivision or site plan that's put before the planning board. I think we do want to audit those as we move forward into the land use code rewrite. And certainly there'd be a role for the Conservation Commission particularly to play in actually looking at those regulations and making some recommendations as part of that process. Gene, you want to add something?
Yeah, Matt, this is all very good stuff, but in my view, it's sort of nibbling around the edges of the greenhouse gas problem. If Nashua really wanted to take the lead on this, it would do something to reduce the hookups of natural gas for new construction and require or incentivize the use of heat pumps, that is electric heating and cooling, instead of natural gas, and also to stop permitting not only natural gas hookups, but biomass burning installations. Both of those would make serious reductions in Nashua's contribution to the greenhouse gas problem. Okay,
I think you're right in a way that we are nibbling around this issue to an extent. I think that it's more clearly stated perhaps in other sections of the draft plan, Gene, but I think you're right that we need to confront it head on. And I think that we maybe internally should talk about how we do that more effectively. And perhaps that's through the recommendations that, or the next level recommendations below these, that we get a bit more specific. But I agree with you that these are maybe not as direct as we'd like them to be at this point in time, and we can certainly move towards that.
Thank you.
In one of our top goals, we have a goal called carbon-free transportation and building design, and this won't be as strongly worded as I think you want, Gene, but it's phase out fossil fuel systems for heating and appliances and encourage the retrofit of full electrification for existing buildings. I think when it comes down to it is the city is worried about making a bunch of sort of policy goals and recommendations that are financially completely unrealistic for the citizens of Nashua. And so saying that all buildings need to be totally, like we need to get rid of all existing natural gas and oil is a tricky thing. So we're saying phase out systems in existing things and encourage retrofit. And then for new buildings, it's something to the effect of what you just said, to be avoiding these things. I mean, I will work on the exact language, but the thing that you're talking about, which is cutting out the use of fossil fuels for new stuff and then phasing it out for the others, that is supposed to be the point. So we'll try to make sure it's more clear. And then to Peter's point about the electric being expensive for heating, I think that's ultimately the catch for why it's tricky to start mandating this stuff right off the bat. What I can say about that is there's a lot of stuff in the plan already about community aggregation and working on carbon neutral electricity for the city. Ultimately, that's actually something which is already going on, where this is not a new idea for the planning process. The energy manager for the city is hard at work trying to sort of make that happen. But ultimately, the city doesn't own the utility right now. And so at the moment, like Eversource does what Eversource does. And so for Nashua to take a little bit more of that destiny into its own hands is a pretty heavy lift. Now, I will say, I know the city is trying to get that done as soon as possible, but you know, that's the biggest challenge before everything else can follow. But we hear you.
I just want to add real quick if I can. I'm very much concerned about this because I'm retired, okay, and I have some electric heating and some gas heating, and there's a huge difference between the two. Electric is extremely expensive, and I just can't get a better job to make up for it. Okay, so it does concern. I think there's a lot of people like me, you know.
I mean, many of the initiatives are basically to, I mean, there's a lot of options, right? One piece is a very complicated thing where you can change, ultimately this via the market, you can sort of disaggregate distribution from supply and potentially via, provable regional, actually existing renewable energy sources, source an equivalent amount of energy as the city's doing. You can have the city negotiate for that. That's kind of the idea of municipal aggregation of electricity. That's one thing, but you know, actually the city of Nashua is thinking about a whole separate piece, which is that feels a little bit like just moving numbers around in the ether. Another piece of it is trying to work on the idea of community solar, or actually having things that the city either owns or helps instigate, so to speak, of processes of generating energy near or around the city. And I think the goal is to try to pursue some combination of these options, but it'll require the cooperation of neighboring municipalities. So some piece of what we're talking about is actually bigger than the master plan because it's bigger than Nashua, but I can confidently say that the city is working as hard as possible to make that happen. So we need to work on the sort of framing language beyond what's in the goals and recommendations, but this is an issue.
Okay, great. That's perfect. We have about 30 minutes left, and I want to go relatively quickly through the next two goals and the actions that come below it so we can have just an open floor discussion at the end of our session tonight. The next section, though, is form and design, and the overall goal is encouraging the use of form-based codes for appropriate neighborhoods and corridors, enhancing character and positively contributing to livability in the surrounding neighborhoods. And to do that, 4 specific actions: creating design guidelines for small infill development projects that are ultimately compatible with the neighborhood surrounding, but higher than what the zoning might currently allow. Second action is encouraging active ground floor uses. This is back to the conversation about whether we allow commercial first floor with residential above in certain areas in the community to really increase neighborhood amenities at a scale that complements the surrounding urban fabric, as we're calling it here. For larger development sites or redevelopment sites, require the development of a finer grained internal street and path network that connects public open space with other amenities. And then lastly, encouraging the creation of open spaces and indoor common areas in any new multifamily residential development or redevelopment that are available both for use by the residents of the new development and the general public. And an example of this is the recently approved Renaissance 2 project with the proposed public dog park that went along with that project. Just a good example of what we're trying to do in that space. Any comments or questions on these sort of form-based ideas here? don't see any hands raised. And if not, I'll move into the next one, then we can open it up and I can stop sharing my screen. Kind of a general idea here, and that is livability and development coordination, encouraging housing redevelopment opportunities that align and coordinate with vibrant mixed use mobility and open space planning. And to do that, working with city departments to address the need for increased infrastructure, including schools, waters, sewers, health, and safety, and encouraging new housing production in areas that are obviously served by existing transit and amenities to avoid the investment that might be necessary for development in new areas. And that gets to that comment about wanting to really focus on redevelopment and infill development rather than the development of existing high natural resource function properties. And then second, looking at actual demographic patterns for residents in newer housing development using 2020 census data at the block level to assess the actual impact of housing construction on potential increases in school age population. We hear sort of the worst four-letter word, kids, uttered when there's any new multifamily development or large development proposed in the community. We'd like to have better data points to determine whether or not those developments are really encouraging or increasing development or load on the schools within the community. Right now, we have some data within specific developments, but getting a broader sense of what's going on there, I think, would allow us to accurately assess and plan for the impact of new units within the community moving forward into the future. And certainly the 2020 data will help us do that. With that, those are the 5 goals and recommendations that we wanted to cover in housing this evening. I'm going to stop sharing my screen and I want to open it up for any questions, comments, concerns, things that might be missing from the conversation that we had this evening that you'd like to see incorporated, or just general thoughts on the housing topic within the Imagine Nashua Master Plan. Any questions or comments? Gene, go ahead. And you're on mute.
In response to Peter's concern about the cost of heat pumps compared to fossil fuels, I just checked on the web and he's correct. The annual operating cost of heat pumps is about 50% higher than the cost of using propane or, in particular, piped natural gas. That means if you're going to get rid of the carbon emissions, you've got to have some kind of subsidy program or some kind of incentive program, probably publicly funded, to ameliorate that difference in cost. But that's true of electric vehicles and everything else. The government has a responsibility to incentivize people to get rid of fossil fuels. Okay. Thank you.
Sure, of course. No, it's a great thought. I think you're absolutely right to some extent. There needs to be a gap closing there in some way.
I mean,
Peter, go ahead. Yeah.
I think I know what the government's going to do, right? They're going to raise taxes on the utilities and the fees and whatnot. So it will come down to us. Okay, but that's the way you do it. The government's not going to give money out to make that happen. They're going to tax utilities to make it happen. It's a lot cheaper to do it that way.
Yeah.
Amber.
My question was around when we were talking about accessory dwelling units and talking about allowing for zoning of a smaller square footage. Is that for apartments only in a mixed use type building, or would that be also for like tiny homes and parcel sizes?
Good question. So the short answer is, well, there are a couple different issues there, I think, and Will or whoever, if I get lost here, my answer, grab me. But we do not currently have a strict minimum size for dwelling units, I don't believe, within the city of Nashua when it comes to multifamily development. There are other controls there when it comes to the building code, and more specifically, the number of units that are allowed in a specific development. So that's really where the pinch point is when it comes to number, not the size of the unit. So obviously, a 500 unit development may not be permitted in some area, but the size of those units is somewhat flexible. Tiny homes are a completely different issue, and Bill McKinney is not on here any longer, but he could speak to this issue. Similarly, tiny homes are regulated in two, or really the concern comes from 2 places. One, they tend to run up against the minimum building standards and building code standards. And so there isn't really a strict minimum size for a single family detached unit, but it is controlled by the dimensions and the code standards within the International Building Code. That said, there are also concerns about tiny homes on wheels that are not on permanent foundations when it comes to utility connections, those sorts of things. Will has a face on that makes me think that maybe he'd like to comment on it, but certainly that's an issue within the state of New Hampshire. And there's been a general lack of interest in having tiny homes on wheels permitted in any community in the state, as far as I know. And that's certainly something that I don't think we've had a conversation about in the city of Nashua. Accessory dwelling units, sorry, Will, go ahead. Yes, please.
He was about to do it, which is I would strongly separate the idea of the tiny home, the tiny home is a lifestyle choice, and it's not one that has sort of panned out as something which a lot of people want to live in. It might be something which people like to have if they want to have the idea of a second home or something, like a little vacation home. They can buy a quarter acre somewhere and build a house where when you use the bathroom, everyone knows because it's one, whatever. Like it has not in many cases worked out as a way to dramatically increase housing supply. So I'll say that it's really important to separate that from the accessory dwelling unit, which I just interrupted Matt for.
No, that's absolutely right. And I just I do want to let Carter jump in too, because he sees a lot of this firsthand, but there's nothing currently that would, other than density restrictions, that would disallow very small single family detached units from being built as part of a traditional or cluster subdivision. It just comes up against that density issue. That's where we're really running into problems. And I think that's what we want to look at when we go through the land use recodification. But Carter, please jump in.
I was just going to say that since the tiny home phenomenon has really come about in the last two or so years, with the popularity of the TV shows, I think we've had maybe just 1 or 2 phone calls of people asking about them. And, as you mentioned, Matt, they really don't meet the building code. But as far as ADUs go, we must have at least 18 to 23, 24 a year coming before the zoning board. So they're a much more popular form of living, so to speak.
Yeah, absolutely. Sherry, did you have something? I see your hand up. I think it's been up for a few minutes.
Yeah, I wanted to ask Will, last week we talked about wood buildings, and that wood buildings can only be built to 4 or 5 stories. Is that correct?
I think it's 5 plus, depending what goes on. Yeah, right. Yeah, sorry.
Yeah. Okay, but a while ago, I remember reading something in one of the woodland journals that I get, and I think it was from the New England Forestry Foundation, and I tried to find it and I couldn't. But aren't they doing a lot of research and work on wood and trying to make it even as durable and sturdy as steel, and be able to go up like double that, like 12 stories? I couldn't find the article, but I thought it was.
Absolutely right. There's this, it's oftentimes referred to as CLT, or cross-laminated timber. Basically, the idea is you can compress, cut, and glue wood in a lot of different ways to make it way, 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 way stronger. It's more expensive. It's not fully figured out. I graduated from planning school in 2013, which I know is somewhat recent, but I am getting older. And, since 2013, it's always been about to be the next big thing. I'm not saying it's never going to happen, but everyone who's saying it's about to happen has been saying that for the better part of a decade. I am fully convinced it will. But I wouldn't bank on that solving the housing crisis for us. In many cases, in places where CLT is being used, at the moment, it's being used for people who are willing to pay a premium for what they see as more environmental sustainability or pushing the envelope forward, or in other parts of the world where actually the CLT is being built on site, like there's a forest nearby and you can do the whole thing on site. But We're not yet at the point where in the United States that happens in a dramatic way. That and sort of modular housing, basically having parts of the housing be constructed somewhere else at a cheaper cost and brought in. Those are the sort of two big, but not having it look like a mobile home, basically, or a manufactured home. I'm sorry. That's where innovation is happening. But until the building code reflects it, it's all kind of hypothetical or academic. Until the building code lets us do that way.
We have had several conversations with developers, particularly in the downtown, about the use of more broadly heavy timber, which is something that the building code does contemplate. But to Will's point, in nearly every case, the financial feasibility the numbers have not worked for its implementation. And so they've gone in another direction. So it's coming up more frequently, but the likelihood of seeing it implemented in the coming years is low, I think. Something significant will need to change in order to make that happen. But I think it would mean quite a bit for our downtown redevelopment in the event that it does become more affordable, but I don't see that happening soon. Okay, any other questions?
And secondly,
yeah, sure, yes.
I applaud the exercise. But it seems to implement it, we probably would need to increase our staff 2 or 3-fold. Am I correct in thinking that? I mean, it seems like it's very aggressive and it's going to be very intensive in terms of staff time.
Sherry, can I ask you specifically what recommendations or goals do you see as creating a tremendous amount of staff? And I don't know, perhaps it is and perhaps it isn't, but what specifically caught your eye that made you think that?
Well, I mean, just the level of detail. Okay, I mean, just in the plan that the plans that are being offered, I mean, there's so many different levels. We're talking about zoning changes, correct?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, you're looking at, changing. It's a whole vision that you're going to put in place, and it just seems to me that the implementation of the various parts is going to take more staff than we have currently. I mean, am I wrong in that?
I think you might be right. I think it's a little challenging to say, but I think we also need to keep in mind that we do get more and more efficient by the day in what we do. And therefore we gain additional capacity as we get better at our jobs. So I think that there is space for us to do some of this. The other piece is this comes with a level of reprioritization of staff effort too. So there may be a need down the road for us to change the way that we do business, particularly speaking for at least my department. We have a very clear process for how we treat applications and we treat the land use development process. That may need to change based on what we see coming out of the master plan, but a lot of the hard, heavy lifting here can be done through the land use code update, in my opinion. Changing the processes that come from that, it will be change, it will be slow, and it may be painful at times, but it's not impossible. And so I wouldn't say that this directly creates the need for additional staff positions to do much of what's being recommended within this plan.
Land use and zoning is the lowest hanging fruit for enacting many of these changes, right? The master plan is the document that, like, once this gets passed, it won't be the force of law, but what it will be is the document that the planning board and everyone else who's trying to figure out what is the intent of the city in every one of these decisions, the zoning enabling acts and that these sorts of laws basically say whatever the thing is the city wants to do should be in accordance with the master plan. That's the phrase that we're looking for. And so these general priorities are the things that the rest of it needs to be in accordance with. That in some ways is a huge effort, because next time the city wants to debate a huge topic or like push forward one of these initiatives, it's not like a whole new thing has to happen to set the idea to be in accordance with. Like the big steps are there. The second biggest thing is zoning, the actual teeth to make many of these changes that are purely regulatory possible. And so the best thing the city can do, and the city wants to do this, is as soon as possible to use the momentum of this planning process and all the lessons learned from it to tweak. It's not fully rewrite, but to modify the zoning code to allow as many of these changes as there can be. From there, the thing you said makes more sense, which is that there's a lot of more complicated administrative, political, bureaucratic issues. And yes, I think Matt and Julie and the crew and Sarah are more efficient by the day, but I'm gonna stay out of appropriations discussions.
No, I think there are some policy ideas here, like the administration of the Housing Trust Fund, that certainly will require additional capacity. So I don't want, Sherry, you're absolutely right on that, but Will said it better than I did, and that is that the first step and perhaps the most impactful one when it comes to the land use code, we can do with our current staff as we have it today, as we're constituted today. So we have a tremendous group of professionals that I know will be able to do this, but down the road there may be a need. Yes. Any other questions or comments or thoughts on housing? No? All right, well, before we go, and certainly jump in if you have any parting thoughts, I just want to thank everyone for joining us this evening for our fifth and final topic conversation. I really appreciate your time, the last 80 minutes of time. It's a great discussion, but I recognize also that some of these things you're hearing for the first time potentially tonight, and if you do want to reach out, provide some feedback, whether you want to contact us directly or certainly use the Google form submission on the Imagine Nashua site, please feel free to do so. As always, feel free to email imagine@nashuanh.gov if you'd like to drop us a comment that way. We're going to be collecting feedback right up until the plan's finalization. Hopefully, fingers crossed, within the next few months here, we'll be bringing this plan to the end of the line. But the plan, like you hear, and it's a cliche, will be a living document. So it's always important to provide feedback, even as we move into that important next step of reviewing the land use code. Again, thank you. Appreciate your time. Enjoy your evenings. And if you want to stick around and discuss, you're certainly welcome to do so. I won't be kicking anybody off, but thank you so much. We appreciate it.